Is it live?
Divij, we're live now. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, hello everyone who is joining. Just waiting for this to be populated. Right. Hi. Thank you everyone for joining. Everyone who's viewing this, everyone who's on this roundtable. I'm really excited that you're all here. Today's discussion is about algorithmic accountability. This is a term that people may or may not be very familiar with, but it's a discussion that's, I think, is very relevant to all of our contemporary discussions around technology, particularly around data, around artificial intelligence, around information technology, around e-governance. I am Divij Joshi. I'm a Mozilla Tech Policy Fellow, and I'm an independent researcher who looks into specifically the implementation of big data, AI, and algorithms in India and framing just and equitable technology policy around that. So why are we discussing algorithmic accountability today? To firstly briefly explain, algorithms are essentially a decision-making process, right? They're a form of taking some form of input and converting into an output through a set of defined rules or a particular process. And in the present context, we're discussing algorithms in the way in which they are, embedded within computerized processes and then embedded within different social and technical constructs, and particularly within the public sector, because I think we're seeing an increasing use of computational algorithms that are being used by the government, which very specifically address or very specifically affect the citizen-state relationship in terms of what kind of benefits do you get, how does the police force work, how is public policy even made, and how does the state see the citizen. These are some concerns that we've already faced in the past few years about when we've spoken about, Aadhaar, about the right to privacy. But I think viewing this from the lens of the decision-making process that goes in to all of these computerized decisions and e-governance processes shifts the lens away a little bit from just looking at data and individual privacy into different kinds of social technical constructs that we have and how they interact with our rights and with our constitutional values. In a report last year by the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty, he warned that the world is stumbling zombie-like into a digital welfare dystopia, which sounds a little strange when you consider all of the hype around AI and big data, particularly that our AI policies in India have been touting. And definitely, while there's a mass potential to do very good, it appears that these systems are now existing in some form of a principled or constitutional void. And India itself is rushing headfirst into this age of AI and data-driven governance without much forethought into what implications this has for our constitutional values and for our rights. Just a few examples of this in the Indian context, and many of you have already worked on these, are the Aadhaar project, where an algorithmic biometric identification system systematically discriminated against certain categories of people like manual laborers or the elderly. Facial recognition similarly uses computational algorithms in a way that's just like very significantly increases the kind of power that the state can exercise over you and over your public movements and over your associations through surveillance. And a more contemporary example, I think, that everyone is going to increasingly face is Arogya Setu, and how the health code through Arogya Setu is classifying whether you're healthy or not, and then that's going to lead to whether you're allowed to travel on a train or a bus or a plane or enter a bank or enter a public shop. These are all incredibly consequential decisions that are being delegated essentially to some form of a technical system, and we need to start exploring and as a democracy have a serious conversation about what the implications of these technical systems are and how we can hold them accountable. So today's discussion is a step towards this interdisciplinary conversation on what these algorithms imply for our democracy or what they imply for our rights, and how we actually end up doing algorithmic accountability. Not just in terms of how do we frame kind of high-level policy or ethics, which are all very important, but also what algorithmic accountability looks like in India. So we're going to start off just with some context setting.
Divij, can I just, for a minute?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. Thanks to everyone for tuning in to this discussion. I'm Samin Mubarak, journalist at Medianama. I'll be helping Divij today moderate the discussion. So this is essentially a new format for all of us at Medianama, where we are helping facilitate discussions around the research and long-term work of the Indian member. Divij, of course, has been working a lot on algorithm. We've had a lot of discussions around that. So that's exactly why we decided to partner with Divij to put together today's discussion. As you can see, we have a lot of speakers and we're running a little short on time, so we won't have time to have a dedicated Q&A session today. So everyone who's attending the session, who's tuned into the session today, please keep asking questions as the discussion progresses, and we can just sort of incorporate them as we move ahead. So those were just little housekeeping rules. Divij, you can take over now.
Great. I'm just going to ask everybody to very shortly introduce themselves, and we'll start in the manner in which the panelists have joined. So we'll start with Rahul. Just 30 seconds to introduce yourself and what your interest in this topic is.
Hi, my name is Rahul Narayan. I'm an advocate on record in the Supreme Court. I was involved in the Aadhaar battle, and I've sort of fallen into the trap of working a great deal in the field of digital rights and how technology impacts governance and how technology impacts our daily lives. This is my area of interest over here. I was involved in the Aadhaar litigation for a long time. So I'm interested in seeing how we can litigate technology processes if it is at all possible or feasible to do so.
Wonderful. Parminder?
I'm Parminder Jeet Singh from IT for Change, which is a Bangalore-based NGO, which works on intersections of ICTs or digital technologies and social change. And we work from the standpoint of equity and social justice in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Alok?
Hi, I'm Alok Prasanna Kumar. I'm a senior resident fellow at Divij, Karnataka. I've broadly been working on issues of law and technology and policy for several years now. And one of my interests is in trying to put in place mechanisms which will foresee how technology will be used rather than reacting to them after they've been used.
Thank you. Dr. Saraf? Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry. I'm Anupam Saraf. I'm a professor and future designer. For the last 30 plus years, I've been working closely on governance and technology issues with governments, NGOs, activists, and citizens. I've been very active on several governance related issues, particularly the Aadhaar over the last decade or so. I've also been one of the petitioners in the Supreme Court on issues relating to the use of Aadhaar, particularly for finance, for linking with elections, and for delivery of subsidies and benefits using Aadhaar, or for its use to identify citizens of India.
Thank you. Kumar?
Hi, I'm Kumar Sambhav. I'm a journalist. I write on issues at the intersection of business, politics, and human rights. I've been working with several publications like Business Standard, Hindustan Times, Scroll. Currently, I'm part of something called a Reporters Collective, which does deep dive investigations and publishes them in multiple languages.
Arindrajit?
Hey, Divij, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I'm Arindrajit Basu. I'm a research manager.
Oops. I think his...
Yeah, we lost him, yes.
Oh, okay. All right, let's move on to Gopal.
Connected buckets.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Arindrajit, we lost you. Yeah, please repeat.
Oh, sorry. It's saying my... Okay, I hope I'm audible now, right?
You are.
Sorry
yes.
about that. Yeah. So I was just saying at CIS, my research focuses on 3 buckets. The first is sort of looking at international processes and sort of global cybersecurity and cyber norms formulation processes.
Mm-hmm.
The second looks at how Indian data governance efforts could potentially shape these processes, particularly in the field of digital trade. And finally, I guess most relevant for this is something that I've not engaged with as much as I would have liked, but starting to engage more with now is AI governance and how regulation of AI, particularly in the public sector, can be shaped through sort of constitutional processes in India. So looking forward very much to learning and sort of contributing to this session. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Gopal?
Hi everyone, my name is Gopal Sathe. I'm a journalist who is now with NDTV. I've been with Huffington Post and Indian Express and a few other places before that. I started writing on these areas, I guess, starting with Aadhaar, and it kind of just expanded. Once you start learning a bit and you meet some people like yourselves, then it kind of just expanded the scope of what I was doing from there.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sahil?
Hey, thanks for putting this together. I'm Sahil Dev. I'm a co-founder of a firm known as CPC Analytics. We work at the intersection of data analytics and public policy. Alongside this firm, we are involved in a few initiatives, one of them being with the data governance network of the IDFC Institute, where we are trying to put together a working group on algorithmic fate and its operationalization in India. So because of that, I'm deeply interested in this topic, and my work is pretty close to this topic. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Srinivas?
Hi, I'm Srinivas Kodali. I'm a public interest technologist. Most of my work involves documenting how technology is affecting democracy, and it started at some level. I've been documenting a lot about other and other related projects, but it's not limited to that. It's mostly limited to all forms of technology that is interacting with citizens at some level through democratic institutions. So I archive code, manuals, and anything related to how technology is interfacing with society.
Thank you. Sudhir?
Thanks, Divij, for having me here. I'm Sudhir Krishnaswamy. I'm a professor of law and at the National Law School. I'm also a trustee at the Center for Law and Policy Research. I've been working on questions of law and technology, broadly interfaces from the early debates around patents and drugs and early internet regulation. It seems like ages ago. I wish I could be spending a lot more time reading about these new debates. And so, and I'm curious about how we're talking about old questions in new ways, including the caption and the title for this session. So I'm very keen to hear and learn more about the work that all of you are doing.
Thank you. Tarunima?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Divij, for organizing this and having me here. I lead project and research at Tattle, which is a civic tech project to archive content from chat apps. We're also building multimodal and multilingual search tools so that, if you receive a message in Telugu, you can actually get some context on it, such as like how long has it been circulating? Has it been circulated with a different message in the past? I'm also a non-resident research fellow at Carnegie, India. In the past, I've looked at how predictive analytics and ML, quote unquote, AI has or does affect access to credit in India as a way to approach this sort of algorithms in society question, but from like a sectoral perspective. So really excited to be here and learn from everyone as well.
Thank you. Urvashi?
Thanks, Divij. Thanks for inviting me. Great to meet you all, meet you all. I hope we can meet in person sometime soon. So my name is Urvashi. I run a small think tank based out of Goa called Tandem Research, and we work at the intersection of tech, society, and sustainability. Much of my work looks at the societal impacts of algorithmic decision-making systems in India and in the global south. And so a lot of our work currently is looking at the gig economy. That's one of the places that which we look at the impact of these algorithmic decision-making systems. And we also do a lot of work on AI ethics and governance. And in the last year, we did a big landscape study looking at the use of AI in various sectors in India: health, agriculture, education, enterprise solutions, so on and so forth. And I think that really kind of drove home the need for thinking about governance frameworks that reflect more closely the institutional, cultural, societal realities of the Indian context, and the need to, in some sense, localize some of the higher level kind of principles that you see in much of this space around algorithmic governance and accountability. So really excited to learn from you all, and thanks again for having me here.
Thank you. Venkatesh? I think you're muted.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much, Divij, for putting this together and inviting me. I work with the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative based in New Delhi. I've been with the Movement for Transparency and Greater Accountability in Government for more than 16 years now. I'm also a co-convener of the National Campaign for People's Right to Information. And this event, I think this discussion is very timely because So far, many of us have been struggling to get human beings who are in power to become accountable to the governed, but now we are trying to make machines and software accountable to the people, and how is that going to happen is something that I'm quite keen to learn, and I hope the discussions will be quite engaging.
Thank you. Vidushi?
Thanks, Divij, and hello, everyone. My name is Vidushi Marta. I am a Senior Program Officer at Article 19. Most of my work looks at machine learning and human rights, and I work in policy and tech spaces. So some of my current work includes working with the EU high-level expert group on algorithmic accountability, looking at UN processes that consider artificial intelligence and their impact on various human rights. I've also been studying the public sector use of algorithmic systems in India, specifically and in the global south more generally. At the same time, I also engage in technical spaces such as the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers that have been developing systems for ethical standards for autonomous systems, I guess, and also doing work on fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning at the ACL. I look forward to our discussions. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Vrinda?
Hi, my name is Brinda, and I'm a Delhi-based litigating lawyer. So I've been involved in litigations like challenging the Aadhaar project, in the surveillance challenge to Section 69 of the IT Act, in the recent Arogya Setu challenge in the Kerala High Court, and in the restoration of internet in Jammu and Kashmir. So my areas of interest lie in digital tech policy and law.
Great, thank you. And with that, we'll just jump into kind of setting the context for this discussion, and to ask what kind of these systems are being implemented in India. What repercussions do they have? And we'll start with Arindrajit. Having worked on the very specific use cases of algorithms, what kind of systems do you see being implemented in India? And are they being done under any specific legal or policy framework, given that we don't have much data protection or data regulation?
Yeah. Thanks, Divij. So I'll sort of limit my intervention exactly to the two questions you asked. Maybe spend 2.5 minutes on the first and 2.5 minutes on the second. So in terms of what, and maybe later on, hopefully get onto some of the regulatory theory that I've also been discussing, but I'll leave that for later. So in terms of what's been going on with other researchers at CIS, 2 years back, we had undertaken a fairly detailed mapping of the governance sector in India, and that was published in July of 2018. And I've been trying to update that sporadically, but it's been difficult to sort of trace comments or statements that were made then to how those initiatives that started out have actually ended up. So keeping that in mind, there are 5 broad trends that I observed then, which I think hold true even now. So first is that the implementation varies across states. There are certain states that are definitely more enthusiastic about using AI in the public sector. So Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and Telangana are examples of these states that are relatively more enthusiastic. The second is that in all these projects, there is some level of private sector involvement at some level, either to a great extent or in terms of conceptualizing the project. So an example is that the Punjab artificial intelligence system, which is basically a predictive policing and facial recognition system, is being developed in partnership with a Gurgaon-based firm called Staku, right? So there is that angle, which is very important from a regulatory and constitutional lens. The third sort of thing we observed is that despite there being a large number of both empirical studies and theoretical literature in other parts of the world, and a fairly robust constitutional edifice that should reflect in the policy documents at the centralized level or even at the specific project level that is made public, basic constitutional principles and sort of these understandings of what went wrong and what could have been done better in other parts of the world has yet to be really reflected in a concrete manner in India thus far. And there are relatively few empirical studies that exist in India, either by the government or by academia. So, of course, a notable exception to that is Vidushi and Shivangi Narayanan's paper on the Delhi predictive policing system, which I think is one of the best papers written possibly world over on this field, but I'll let Vidushi talk more about that. But these are sort of 5 high-level trends we observe. Now, let me get on to the sectors that sort of varies interest across varying states. So in the AI and governance field, we mapped out 5 sectors. So the first one is law enforcement. And like I said, I will not delve too much into this because Vidushi has a fairly detailed paper on that. But again, there is the key problem I observed is that in addition to all the sort of constitutional concerns regarding discrimination or privacy, one major concern is simply the lack of publicly available information. Given that this is something that impacts the rights, particularly of vulnerable communities, the lack of publicly available information here is a key problem. And again, the only sort of repository information we have is that one paper, which is not enough. Second is education, and in education there have been multiple use cases of AI. So right from monitoring school dropouts that the Andhra Pradesh government has been working on, to sort of just ensuring that this ed tech system comes in where students' curriculums are devised based on their learning capabilities. There has been a fair bit of enthusiasm for the government to roll out AI projects, although again they've not been as public with their disclosures as they could have been. Again, you could say that there are different kinds of risks. I wouldn't necessarily say less number of risks with education, particularly given that there are sort of children involved and the questions of consent around that. That also exists with education, and that leads to a separate regulatory spectrum. The third question that I won't go into now, the third sector rather I won't go into now, is defense. But I don't think that is so relevant to public service delivery. But there is definitely enthusiasm to develop AI in the defense sector and contribute to the global debate on autonomous weapon systems. It's just unclear whether the army and the military trust the developments in the Defense Research Department organization yet. The fourth one, which I've done a number of deep dives on, is agriculture. So just an example of this is the government of Karnataka has been partnering with Microsoft to basically provide farmers alerts on their cell phone on what is the ideal date and what is sort of to sow crops based on weather and ideal crop yield and soil conditions after some level of data aggregation. This, of course, while there have been public statements made by both the Karnataka government and by Microsoft, which we have tracked, questions on evaluations, question on audits, question on what empirical assessment was done before the project was rolled out is, and of course, even results is not in public circulation as much as it should be. The only thing that we do have is a cursory reference in the Niti Ayog's strategy that came out a couple of years back again, which suggests that not this project, but another similar project that Microsoft had undertaken with ICRISAT in Andhra Pradesh apparently yielded a 20 to 30% increase for farmers. Again, the numbers behind this are relatively unknown. So, and then the one, which is, again, we studied in that report, but thankfully it's not yet come into India, is use in judicial sentencing. And there has been discourse around AI in courts and improving court processes, but using AI in the sentencing process is something that will require a lot of constitutional thought that thankfully it hasn't happened yet. Very quickly onto the policy vision, and I realize I spent too much on the first half, but very quickly on this, there are basically 3 or 4 national level strategies that all sort of echo certain sentiments of ethics and broad policy vision, some of which are useful. So one very useful tool that should be used but is not used across is the Niti Ayog strategy that proposed something called AI for X, which is where a specific gap is identified in a certain process and AI is targeted to fill that specific gap X. So it's not as if AI is randomly imposed. But as we've seen throughout use cases, for example, through AI in content moderation, which you are quite familiar with, Divij, in the intermediary liability guidelines, it was just more of a sort of AI is there, let's use it, that's fun. So I think that is one particularly useful tool. But apart from that, both the task force that was set up by the Ministry of Commerce, the Niti Ayog strategy, and a number of papers that came out recently from MeitY, from the government level, there hasn't been addressing a few key things that are missing. One is India's basic constitutional edifice. None of these statements referred, and not just this, but any policy document, even, for example, the recent National Open Digital Ecosystem Policy, doesn't refer to our fairly rich constitutional guarantee, right? So that is one thing that's missing. The second thing that's missing is, of course, reference to previously conducted studies or what went wrong and what didn't go wrong in other parts of the world and with this. And finally is sort of deferring to specific context. So it doesn't actually suggest how different use cases call for different regulatory tools. And that's a paper that I've been working on with my colleagues, and Divij, of course, you've reviewed that. So there is definite things missing here. Again, at the state level, there are very few high-level AI policies. In fact, I've not seen any publicly, but I would say that in the states that have been relatively more successful, if you like, there have been robust policies in the sectors where AI was being implemented, which allowed for that implementation to potentially be more successful. So AI in agriculture, even though there has been a complete black hole in terms of public disclosure, you could argue that, I mean, the government at least seems to think that there is some sort of tangible improvement, and there are reasons why I think the risks associated with this are different and potentially less than risks associated with other sectors. But I'll stop here, and hopefully I can come back later on to discussing why I think certain use cases need to be regulated differently based on the impact that they can have on constitutional rights and basic tenets of dignity. I hope I didn't go over. Yeah,
just a little bit, that's all right. So just, leaping on from that, Parminder, so, we've mentioned about how we don't really have a policy context right now, but we see that the government of India is, at least at the central level, very, pushing very hard for this. Can you explain the kind of thinking, behind all of these moves to regulate and think about data-driven governance at the policy level? We've seen things like non-personal data come into the play. We've seen things like the National Open Digital Ecosystem. What's driving this, and what are the kind of major concerns? In 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Divij. I'm not sure I'll be able to tell the government's thinking behind it, but I can tell my thinking on the side associated with it and how I see those initiatives. And I think before we talk about harms of data-based decision-making in the government, we need to talk about why data-based decision-making is at all necessary in the government, whether it is at all necessary. And the problem here is that often, this, whether it is necessary or not, gets conflated with bad decision-making. A lot of people seem to, I'm not making the allegation, seem to make it look like that if governments were not making data-based decision-making, it would be better off. And I just beg to differ from that. And I'm just trying to place it in context why data-based decision-making is necessary. Now, I define digital as being database decision-making. Before that, there were software companies, then there were internet companies, but companies became digital when database decision-making takes place. So digital is defined, in how I look at it, by database decision-making. So if there is a digital society and there is a digital private sector, is there a need for digital state at all? Is the first question. And a lot of people seem to say that if database decision-making doesn't take place, it's good, but that means there is no digital state. The state remains at the industrial age level while the rest of the world moves on. And what are the losses of that? And the second point is that in the industrial age paradigm, there are public infrastructural and public governance roles, and then there are private sector roles, and these roles have been separate. Do such separation of roles also exist within the digital society, whereby we as large-scale systems do need to take certain kind of database decision-making? And would that decision-making all take place within private sectors, or would government need to take some of those decisions? And if it does not take those decisions, what happens to the society? Much less I'm worried about what happens to the government. Now, Arinderji talked about education. Now, education is a good example. Now, public education is generally considered a state responsibility. And we increasingly see, and I've seen it in China, there are huge private initiatives which are based on AI-based education, which completely changes the current classroom-based education paradigm. We have seen it with Baiju and all. And what happens if all education-based database decision-making takes place in private sector? What happens to public education as a government role? And same with health and agriculture and so on. So what we need is to save some of these spaces, and we can decide whether in digital society we need to save some other roles for the public sector than in the industrial age, but there would always be some very strong roles, and we need to be careful about that. Second part, now I'm placing two initiatives of the government in this thinking. Now, one is the non-personal data, the use of the term community data, the section 91 of the personal data bill, which says the government can take over those data. So all of them are very badly drafted right now. the question is that unless government has access to a lot of such data, you can't do data-based decision making. And right now, only private platforms collect all that data. So there would have to be some kind of NPD which goes under public control, under constitutional guarantees, and so on. And that's one important part of government's role in database decision making. And second is the node policy, which is a little more vague. But again, one of the way private sector controls systemic decision making about a society, database decision making about a society, is to control its rule making, its protocols, and its platforms. And whether these platforms and protocols and rule making has to be with a public agency or a more neutral agency is what, for me, at the heart of the nodes draft, which is wrong in many other ways. So these are the two initiatives being placed in this thinking that government needs to make certain database decision making. In the last minute I'm left with, I will talk about what actually happens and why so much criticism comes about the way mostly government takes this decision in a wrong manner. One, and the lesser reason, is that in almost most of the cases, and this also Rinajit talked about, they're outsourced to the private sector. Almost always private sector is asked to take decisions on behalf of the government. And the problem is that private sector's whole thinking and everything about them is different. It's commercial. So they would not do things as the state is supposed to do in our constitutional terms. The only way, therefore, to not have it, therefore, is for government to develop its own public sector capacities of developing principles-based algorithms and principles-based decision-making systems, which therefore means that rather than having less capacity to have internal database decision-making, there has to be more capacity and less dependence in the private sector. Second part is, and Divij's paper refers to this book on automated inequality, and where it has been said that it's largely technology is not neutral, and it is the intentions behind the state's conduct which shows in the technology, and which were largely neoliberal and austerity led. Now that's a fact, and I completely believe that. But that also means that there could be some technology initiatives which are informed by other ideologies. And therefore, the question is not whether government takes wrong decisions, but what does it invest those decisions towards. For example, in welfare, you can always have a government is always thinking and is suspicious of the citizen-state relationship and looks in terms of frauds and wrongdoings. And there could be AI which is devoted to figuring out that even with our best systems, some people are left out, and that AI can be used to find out those people who are left out by the databases of the rational bureaucracy of the industrial age. And the last point, I'm saying that every time a big system changes from the feudal age to the industrial age, some gaps remain. Now look at feudal age. What was welfare system in a feudal age? A guy will walk into a village and find the most deprived person and directly seeing the deprivation give food to them. Now in industrial age, the rational bureaucratic systems are data-based, and in those database systems, we know that there are gaps. You can go to a village, there's a widow out there, very poor, but the parameters have not matched in the government database and she falls off. Now that happens, but doesn't mean that rational bureaucratic systems are not good and do not make possible large-scale governance systems. In the same way, database systems are also required as a different paradigm, and their shortcomings have to be plugged in a different manner. Thank you.
Thanks, Parminder. That's an incredibly helpful contextualization of how the government should be or could be thinking about this. And to kind of delve a little deeper into that, we actually have Dr. Anupam Saraf has worked closely in the context of smart cities, in the context of government departments who think about these solutions. So perhaps, Dr. Saraf, could you tell us, when does a government, what do they think about when they try to implement datafied systems or automated systems? What is the thought process that you've observed from your works on smart cities that specific government departments, in this absence of a overarching policy, think about to move from, say, a traditional kind of human decision-making towards an automated decision-making system?
Well, before I answer your question, I want to take a step backwards and really ask about the context of actually creating procedures or formula or algorithms, as we call them, in order to make decisions about public good or about governing a community. So if you look at it, you and I and all of us are actually engaged in different relationships with each other. We engage in markets where buyers and sellers come together to create a market system. We engage with people who are money lenders or borrowers to create a banking system. We engage with people who want to learn to create some kind of a learning or educational system. We engage with representatives to create a representative system between the representatives and the represented. So these different systems really bring together different people for some common purposes that they may share. And when you look at it, it is in this context of this common purpose that this system must be governed. So if those who are governing the relationships that we form in society do not share equally the consequences of the rules, the procedures, the mechanisms, the formulas, and the algorithms that they create, then essentially you are laying ground for creating exploitation, injustice, and parasitism. So I think in some ways, we have lost track of the fact that life is all about these relationships. It's not about just dividing society into the governed and the governors. It's really about ensuring that we all will be able to live a dignified life. We will have some justice and fairness. So if you really look at many technologists equating algorithms with code or with law, code with law, and essentially if you really look at it, if you look at the procedures that are laid out in our acts and laws, and if you look at the algorithms, there is an incredible amount of similarity. And if we really look at this myth that we have propagated in the process, is that because essentially the laws that are created through a democratic process, we feel that they are accountable. Whereas algorithms, because they are created by technology, we feel that they are not accountable. In some sense, the democratic process is accountable to those who fund the electability of those who govern. And the algorithms are accountable to the venture capitalists and the business owners of those who fund the businesses that create algorithms. So in some sense, both are driven by market and both are driven by some kind of interest in order to be able to make more money. And therefore, it is extremely important to recognize that whenever we are actually applying any kind of algorithms and any kind of means to create law and new legislation in our society, we are essentially making business decisions. These decisions are driven by business rather than an understanding of the relationships that people enjoy with each other to live their lives. And I think we have several examples, but the closest at hand right now is of the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you see the plight of people and the different realities of their life, they cannot be replicated into orders of government which dictate what people may or may not do during this pandemic. So when you look at the hordes of migrants trying to make their way back to their native places, I think it's important to recognize that their reality of their relationship or their failed relationship with those who employed them, those who actually gave them houses where they used to live, have failed. And those who govern our systems have completely failed to understand what is the relationship that the migrant workers had with those who employed them, what is the relationship that the migrant workers had with the slums in which they occupied themselves or that they called as their home. And somewhere we have failed to recognize that there is no mechanism that we understand the context and those who govern us don't share the same consequences. So it's important for us to recognize that when you simply give away to algorithms, whether they be legislation or whether they be machine-driven algorithms or automations, we are completely oblivious of whether we recognize the ethics of the people, the participants who are involved. We are completely writing away the compassion that needs to be there on part of the decision maker who is taking the decisions. We completely are oblivious of the dignity of the participants of the system for whom we are taking decisions. We completely forget about the justice that cannot be delivered. We simply believe that by creating a procedure, we have created a means to deliver justice, but nothing could be further away from the truth. We also don't recognize that we are creating an unforgiving and an irreversible system, because whatever we implement through our laws and our algorithms is usually very unforgiving, cannot be subject to appeal, cannot be subject to the human compassion, and somehow we feel that we actually are making progress. So in this context, if you look back and see what we are doing when we talk about smart cities, or whether we talk about e-governance, and whether we talk about use of technology in government, I think we are doing all of this. We are really creating systems which are oblivious of and unparticipatory. We are delegating powers to the lives of people and their relationships to those who are not equally and similarly affected by the decisions that they take. And I think the fundamental cornerstone of making algorithms and laws accountable is that those who make these decisions have to be equally and similarly affected by those decisions.
Thank you. That's very helpful context and framing for how kind of we should think about this, and kind of studying up maybe is one of the terms that's used to look at the consequences that these systems could have for the people actually deploying them and making them aware of that. And that kind of segues into the next question which I had for Vidushi. Vidushi, you studied in much detail, as Arindajit mentioned initially, how police departments have been using these systems. And I think that specific context of how do we look at the context of government agencies in India, which we kind of see as these massive offices filled with like paper files, and with officers with very little idea of what they're doing, and then you suddenly introduce complex algorithmic systems into their working. How do you see this play out specifically in the context, and given everything that you've studied?
Thanks, Divij. I think you're right in that there's a fundamental breakdown of logic in many ways, because on one hand, police departments are using Windows 95, and on the same, in the same sentence, they're talking about predictive policing and stopping crime before it happens. I want to frame my answer to your question in context of why India is fundamentally different and why we need to start from the ground up instead of thinking about how this is done elsewhere in the world. And to make a very specific point, usually when we talk about accountability of algorithms or accountability of institutions, it's predicated on one of two things. So it's either you look at the input and the output and you try and reverse engineer a complicated system to understand the impact, or you do audits of the system itself, of the technical system itself, to try and understand what the impact will be, whether it's disproportionate, is there demographic parity when you deploy a system in a society that is fundamentally unequal. Now, both of these are not available to us in the Indian context, as we learned. My co-author on the Delhi paper, Shivangi Narayan, is also on the call. What we learned was that you cannot study a system that is not open to being shared at all. So initially, when we started thinking about the Delhi case study or the Delhi predictive policing project. What we wanted to do was kind of understand how the system was built, what the models looked like, how the models were optimized, what were they tested like, what were the accuracy rates, things like that were very specific to the system. But we realized that because there's such a breakdown of like RTI, because there's a breakdown of accountability mechanisms within institutions, we had to study the institution itself. So we had to study how data was thought of within Delhi Police to understand how data will be used in this opaque system. Another piece of work that I've done is looking at smart cities in Pune, where I looked at smart sanitation systems and try and understand the impact it had on sanitation workers that it was meant to liberate and it was meant to help, because there's a toilet board coalition that is meant to make sanitation workers' lives easier. And what we found was actually it's just a surveillance mechanism that is deployed by a company that is outsourced to a company, even for questions of governance. So for instance, when we went to the municipal corporation and said, can you tell us a little bit about these systems and why they're used and how you decide where they're used? How are you working with sanitation workers unions? The answer we got was, well, the company decides that because it has to, serve their bottom line as well. So the idea that we can understand accountability of systems by looking at the system themselves is completely broken because of all of the legal processes that, aren't available to us. So where does that leave us? And please tell me if I'm overshooting for time, which I didn't look at when I started. Where that leaves us is firstly trying to understand in what ways are we optimizing for systems. So if you go to a technical standardization body like the IEEE and you try and understand where transparency as a concept comes from, then we can try and begin to understand what transparency on the field should look like. But if we start only studying systems once they are deployed or once we read about them in the newspaper, we're already too late because all of the accountability mechanisms that we have are only available to us at the time at which we're designing and developing systems. And also, I think being more critical of the power structures that institutions themselves cement is something that is incredibly important and also missing, I think, in the global context, definitely, and in India specifically. And again, I won't go into the details of our papers, either on the Delhi or the Pune case study. I will share links to that later. But essentially thinking about what are the assumptions that go into thinking that we have to use these systems? So if we're saying we're going to use predictive policing systems to try and stop crime, then we have to ask, well, what does that predictive policing system even look like? What are you optimizing for? What is the impact that you want to have? Because the idea of actual impact and output that we would, in an ideal world, have access to, we have none of. So I'm going to stop there, just in the interest of time, but I'm very happy to take further questions.
Thank you. And yeah, from that, I think we have an interesting question about, communication surveillance specifically, and how algorithms are kind of mediating communication, particularly, I think, Urvashi, you've kind of written about, how the government is viewing citizens in the context of algorithmic systems and AI, and how it impacts democracy. So, could you explain a little more about your work on this and how you think, AI changes the citizen-state relationship and why it has an impact on democracy?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Divij. It's very hard to go after so many great speakers, so I might end up repeating something that people have already said, in which case you can cut me off. So we released a paper recently to look at how AI systems are recasting democracy in India. And in particular, we looked at kind of three facets of the state-society relationship. We looked at issues of political mobilization, we looked at the use of AI in public systems, and we looked at citizen engagement. And obviously, we're using the term AI, quote unquote, quite loosely here, right, in terms of kind of algorithmic, automatic decision-making systems. But before I go to that, maybe just like 2-3 quick points, right, which I think came out as a kind of overarching, which stood out as an overarching kind of insights from this study. And one is that what really stands out in the Indian context, and this is what I was also referring to, the landscape study that we've done, is really weak institutional, regulatory, and societal capacity, which means that how AI is understood, how problems are defined, how problems are managed, there's huge issues there, right? I think what's also interesting, what came out in the Indian context is that, I mean, we already know this, but what came out when speaking to a lot of developers, or their lack of kind of appreciation of this, is the high levels of societal heterogeneity, right? And so what that means for kind of problems of accuracy in an algorithm, and even if you're trying to eliminate bias or eliminate discrimination, the kind of intersectionality that you see in the Indian context is, I'm not saying unique, but it's certainly very, very relevant. And the last kind of overarching point is the role of the private sector, right? And I think both Parminder and I've been doing this, Iranjit mentioned it, right? And so we're seeing a huge role of the private sector. We're seeing it particularly, I feel, at the state levels. And here there's a bit of a kind of tension where on one hand, you see that, you have these local governments who, in one sense, that this problem of capacity is particularly acute. And so you have a lot of private sector actors, in some sense, defining the problem and then the solution being developed in terms of that definition, right? But at the same time, what we also see when we spoke to a lot of state level governments is that a lot of them also under increasing pressure from central governments to implement kind of AI solutions or to demonstrate themselves as being AI forward. And so there's a tension there, right? And I think what is interesting, and just to go back to what Parminder was saying also, that yes, certainly we do need to build state capacity so that you don't have such a large private sector influence, but you still, in the absence of that state capacity, you still have the private sector defining those problems. And I think increasingly what we're seeing now is also the distinction between the state and the private sector is becoming much, much more blurry, right? So I think that problematizes this kind of dichotomy between the private sector and the government. So to go to what we saw in the paper, and I'll just go over it very quickly. I think I should be okay on time, but stop me if I'm not. So with regard to political mobilization, one of the things that we saw is that there is, already, the Indian election in 2019 was already dubbed as one of a social media election, a big data election. And we all are already aware of the kind of information silos or echo chambers that this creates and what this might mean for political mobilization. But one of the things that really stands out to me is that it also creates massive information asymmetries. And these information asymmetries, in some sense, cut at the core of what it means to have a deliberative democracy, right? To have an engaged citizenry. Another thing that we saw is that there is a growing combination of offline and online strategies to collect data. So you're actually able to achieve a level of kind of granularity that was not possible by only online solutions, right? So even something that Cambridge Analytica would not have been able to get this kind of complex mix of offline and online. And equally related to that, what we see is that the nature of data, that the nature of content is also changing. So you see much more audiovisual content, you also see much more humorous content, you see much more derogatory content. And that, because that is more clickbaity, etc. And related to that, we also saw that there's a change in how the kind of campaign arm of political parties is being organized. So there's a much greater centralization of power with the IT cells, in some sense, calling the shots, and the campaign apps that your lower level party cadres use also being used then to monitor these same people, right? To see to what extent are they doing their campaigning and what the issues are there. And some of the work that Joyjit Pal and the crew at MSR have done is really excellent. So I would recommend that you have a look at that. But there's also a flip side to this, right? And maybe I'm just trying to find some balance here, but there are some interesting studies. So for an example, some of Payal Arora's work, where she talks about just how valuable this personalization is, right? So it's easy for us to be critical of it, etc. But for certain parts of the population, it does mean, or at least appears to me, in a sense of kind of inclusion, right? Or something like NLP, like could that enable better participation or different forms of participation? On the public systems, I don't think I need to share with this crowd various examples that they're in our paper, and I think you all are very well aware of them. There's been a whole bunch of kind of interventions to try and use AI whether it's using it for Swachh Bharat or using it in smart cities or predictive policing. We've also recently put out a tracker which looks at the kind of the tech tools that are being used for public health vis-a-vis COVID, and I'll share the link with you all. But you will see there that there is a huge push for kind of the use of AI-based solutions for managing the COVID crisis as well, right? And again, these are problematic for many reasons. We've, the work that you shared, Divij, that you've done, as well as some of the, or you shared on the reading list, already points to kind of issues of bias and discrimination, etc. But I think there's certain things that are unique or stand out in the Indian context, and it reinforces what Vidushi was saying. But that one of them, I think, is that these systems are being applied in institutional settings in which you have issues of caste, race, etc., very, very deeply embedded, right? So, I mean, really echoing what Vidushi was saying, the problem around algorithm accountability, if we're thinking about accountability, we're thinking about governance, we also need to ask what is the object of governance, right? Or what is the object of accountability? And I don't think the algorithm here is the object of that accountability. I think it's the system that needs to be the object of that accountability. And that's the shift that we need to make, right? And equally, I think one of the things that we were seeing is that there's also a kind of, there's an interesting kind of notion or this idea that these two scholars, Ali Akhtar and Michael Bernstein, posed, they call on street level bureaucrats, right? So you have street level bureaucrats, which are lower level kind of civil servants. And in some sense, they are able to be much more reflexive about their decision making, right? So what happens when algorithms come into this, take over that role, and what happens to that reflexivity, right? And what happens to the power of these lower level bureaucrats, and how is their agency being changed, right? So I think when we're thinking about, and I'll conclude with this, when we're thinking about algorithmic accountability, when we're thinking about algorithmic governance, we need to think about context, right? And we also need to think about context in terms of how power shifts within that context across various actors, whether it's the private sector or whether it's your local bureaucrat, right? And only then I think we can have a substantive and meaningful kind of progress on questions of accountability and governance. So I'll stop there, but obviously happy to chime in later.
Thank you. And on one of the points that you mentioned earlier, that how do we, when we don't know anything about these systems, it's impossible to hold them accountable. And also looking at this from a perspective of not just the algorithm itself or the technical system, but also the logic of the whole political and social system through which this is embedded, or through which this comes into being. Venkatesh, you've done a lot of work studying this kind of decline in accountability and transparency of the Indian state in general, but also specifically in the context of these large-scale implementations of technical projects like Aadhaar or like the social media monitoring tool. Could you tell us a little bit more about your work in transparency, about how kind of governmental transparency is being affected by the centrality of these technological systems and kind of public-private partnerships from your experience?
Yeah, thank you very much, Divij, for the opportunity to share my thoughts. I certainly do not want to give the impression that I am an expert on the topic of this webinar, about which so many speakers have already who have preceded me have spoken so eloquently and have highlighted some of the crucial problematic areas. Perhaps my own lack of understanding of the adequate understanding of the issue might make my submission right now sound a little rhetorical, but I think a little bit of rhetoric, I think, would be important to remind ourselves, in this kind of a discussion. The first one is what I would like to point out is, this concept of open society, which emerged between the First and the Second World War. And if I were to just read out a very brief description of the attributes of an open society, which of course was first coined by the French philosopher Henri Bergson, and then a big fat tome was written by the British philosopher Karl Popper. So in short, it says in open societies, the government is expected to be responsive and tolerant, and its political mechanisms transparent and flexible. It can be characterized as opposed to authoritarianism. Now, I certainly do not want to give readers the impression that I am a big supporter of these very ideas, because all of the idea of open society has been subjected to considerable academic evaluation, critical evaluation over the last few decades. But then the basic themes of an accountable system of governance, democratic decision-making process, accommodation for diversity, and openness in what the government does. Now, these are attributes that we cherish, qualities that we would like to see embedded in the very foundation stone of governance even today. Now, I leave it to the imagination or to the thinking of our panelists and our attendees here to make an assessment of how far India's political economy and society has progressed along the path to becoming an open society. We are now faced with the challenge of becoming a digital society, and we don't even know what that means. What is that vision? Where is it articulated? Is it to be found in the discussions of Niti Aayog, or in their papers, or is it to be found in some files which are not really accessible to people in across departments? There is no discussion. Now, transparency helps, but then getting the transparency out is a big problem. And this is where I want to bring in my second point. You see, the difficulty that we are facing today is because we are breaking our heads at the doors of the executive. And how is executive sphere of action understood in law? Executive sphere of action, in the best of, in my understanding, according to our case law established so far, is the residue of state action after you take away legislative and judicial spheres of action, which means it's an undefined area. It's an unregulated area as far as laws are concerned. There are many things that the executive does, without the sound backing of a law approved by people's representatives. It is these kinds of actions are financed by budgets which are approved by the people's representatives, who very often do not have the time to discuss the nitty-gritties and the intricacies of the newer and newer actions that the governments are taking, departments are taking to make people more and more transparent to themselves. So this is, some of us have not even begun to fathom the depths to which we need to probe decision-making processes in government, because they're completely devoid of public inputs. Now, experts might be involved, they might be involved from the public sector, they might be, advocacy groups might be involved, which is fantastic. But people like me, people who are not not highly literate, people who are not completely conversant with these kinds of issues, we do not get to know what exactly is going on. For example, I just learned of the paper that Vidushi has written, and I've just downloaded it in order to read it. What is it that this Delhi police is doing? We are still stuck about how the constable did not actually lift a finger to prevent the communal violence that rocked North Delhi for several days. We are still stuck in that, whereas the government has gone so much beyond the traditional understanding that we have about law enforcement. Very briefly, I want to make one point, and then I'll stop here. My colleague and I, we were on a tour of some of the district police headquarters in Uttarakhand, and we came across the board, one board that was put up on top of a room in one of the police control rooms, which said social media monitoring cell. And we asked the people there as to what exactly was the social media monitoring that was going on. And they said that they've actually got a software that looks at all the social media messages that are floating around, so that they can identify potentially harmful messages of those which are likely to incite the commission of crimes, and then they will take action on that. There has been no public discussion on what this software is all about, who supplied this software, how much money was spent on it, whether authorization was granted by the state legislature in an informed manner for spending money on that. So the basic principles that inform all these actions that the executive is taking are not even debated in parliament. And in order to be able to debate it, even before the people, I think it is the people's representatives who need to get that basic information about what is it that the government is doing, what kinds of options have actually been pursued, what kind of alternatives have been examined, and now how is it that the machine analyzable, machine readable, and machine calculable decision-making process is what is going to govern various sectors of decision-making inside government. I think this is something that is really crucial, and this is actually a greenfield area, to the best of my understanding, that needs to be probed, because all of this information, which is not yet out in the public domain, is available in government files, either in hard copy or on their computers or on their WhatsApp storage devices. So these are official records, these are public records, and every one of them is amenable to a right to information request to ask for this information. And that is my central message. We don't know enough. Let's stop cribbing. Let's start asking questions using the right to information law. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's actually a fantastic segue into this next section of our conversation, which is to think about doing algorithmic investigation or think about doing algorithmic accountability. And the first first person I want to kind of consult on this is Sahil. You work in both kind of at the bridge of developing these systems and thinking about the policy as well. And so it would be wonderful if you could, take this conversation forward to tell us what you think about what transparency means for the different stakeholders, right? For a developer, it could be like, super clean code, but what does it mean for the government? What does it mean for individuals? When we say algorithmic transparency, what are we trying to convey?
Yeah, thanks, Divij. So I think a lot of the inputs were excellent. I would try and be more optimistic about this since I'm an engineer. I look at the world and I feel that everything can be corrected. Right? So let me first start by discussing quickly what you mentioned to be the definition of an algorithm. Right? You said that you use the words defined rules. Right? So one big change with machine learning or AI is this very notion of rules, right? So
your audio is
Sorry,
your audio went off. Could you just repeat that, Sarthak?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So you use the word defined rules. So as we now speak of machine learning and AI, like firstly, we need to note that there's a lot of buzz around this. So a lot of what is said to be AI or ML is actually not AI or ML. It's just old algorithms or conventional statistics. But if we speak really about AI or ML, a lot of the defined rules are no longer as defined as we want them to be. Right. So the very need for transparency or accountability stems from that. The fact that that's one part. The second part is, so we have been coding neural networks, say for the last 10 years. Coding a neural networks 6-7 years ago was a pain, right? Like it was really a pain. Now, anyone, even on the panel with very less coding background, can download a package off the internet and operationalize a neural network pretty quickly, right? So that's the change that we are faced with, which means that someone who might not know the entirety of this algorithm can operationalize this algorithm pretty quickly. So that again means that there is a greater need for transparency because a tool is being used without really understanding what lies inside the tool, even at the very developer level, right? So that's from the need perspective. Now, the question you asked was, what does transparency mean, right? And what does it mean to different stakeholders? So in this time limit, like of a few minutes, it's difficult to really answer that for all the stakeholders. But principally, what I feel, just adding to what the other panelists said, is it's not that product teams who are developing this code, it's not that they don't think about these topics, right? Saying that they're just focused on the bottom line, I think is a very simplistic binary perspective. And so they do have these questions. We do interact with them frequently. And we feel that our interventions are really trying to equip engineers who typically stay away from social science, law, etc., on how to think through these topics, right? How to think through concepts such as transparency. And alongside this, I think there are techniques such as explainable AI, etc., which are emerging, which try to think through these topics again at an operational level, but from an implementation perspective. So what I would like to highlight is, while we speak about principles and the abstract aspects of this discussion, in parallel, code is being written, algorithms are being put out there. So we also need to focus our energies on the operational aspects of transparency. Thanks. I don't know if that was answering your question.
That, yeah, I mean, it did to some extent. And I think I'd also like to bring in Srinivas into this, because he's worked extensively on kind of actually doing the querying work and looking at what kind of public documents are relevant to looking, to interrogating algorithmic accountability or interrogating algorithmic and technological systems. On from this discussion about like looking into algorithmic systems, looking into government systems, what are the ways in which, according to you and through your work, government technological systems can be investigated using publicly available documentation, and how successful has it been?
Okay, so there are very few ways one can investigate algorithms from an outside, right? Like traditionally, these are black boxes, so you can't look what they're doing. Not everybody is Nandan Nilekani who can go to government and say, hey, you have a bug, let me look under the hood and let me fix it. So what you have to do is essentially inspect these systems from outside. Also, if my audio is breaking, do let me know. So what I've been doing primarily, some of my projects which were involved in the smart city stuff, I'm a civil engineer. I was investigating how some of these smart city systems were faring. For example, take the case of the Bangalore BMTC, the Bangalore Metropolitan Transport Corporation's transport algorithm, which tells you when the bus comes. Right? They claim that the algorithm is accurate to tell you the bus comes under 2 minutes. But if you have to evaluate it, all you have to probably do is look under hood of their app, start recording the GPS data of the buses and the prediction times. And when you do a comparative analysis, you will know when the bus actually arrived and what time was being predicted that the bus would arrive. This is a very simple example. In this case, you don't have any penalizations. The max you're losing out is that you're waiting more for a bus, right? If it's being predicted that the bus is going to come in 5 minutes, but it takes, say, half an hour. But when you bring this into systems like, say, penalizing a commuter for, say, overspeeding in the traffic scenario itself. So machines have errors. Hardly anyone tells you what these error is, like even systems like speed guns or image processing based systems which are trying to actually identify the speed through video alone. There are sometimes you would see that you are being penalized even though you were actually going under the speed limits. But nobody in India challenges these. Like there is no mechanism to challenge these. Sometimes you do get fined because someone else has actually copied your registration number. It does happen, especially auto walas. What they tend to do is they know they're doing illegal, right? So what they do is they just copy someone else's registration number. So all the fines go to that other person. So there are basic systems and issues which no AI or even the cop won't know. They just find it because the machine saying that, oh, this is the number which has been detected through OCR, and we just find this guy. So the only way to detect some of these systems now is from the outside. You actually mine, you reverse engineer a lot of this. In fact, probably some of the things that I wanted to do was probably use a bike and actually go over speed and test it. But again, these are things that are fairly under the limbo where one could say it's illegal. But these systems are, in my opinion, are illegal. They do not have any backing of the law. They are taking over the function of the executive, and there is no mechanism one can challenge these. To illustrate a larger issue which I have investigated in the next 2-3 minutes, there was this scenario where other data was being used to link voter data and to remove who are the duplicate persons across India. It started with Hyderabad. There were pilot implementation for this happened in Nizamabad and Hyderabad of Telangana in 2014. All of this was pre-Aadhaar Act of 2016. So what we would do is Telangana had essentially all the data of its citizens, which it collected using a grand survey post the bifurcation of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. So it just used all of the data it had to identify people who are at the location where their electoral address claims to be. So they were comparing the address data in Aadhaar and the address data in voter ID. Often these are different, right? One has a residential address and one is a permanent address. So they simply compared this data and essentially did all of this on their own. They never informed citizens that they were doing this. So they just went and collected this data on their own. And this was also collected from other departments, not necessarily directly from citizens as well. And they eventually used this to remove a few lakhs of voters. When I say a few in India, in Telangana, it was around 40 lakhs. In Andhra Pradesh, it was around 30 lakhs. So around 70 lakh people were deleted from electoral lists. And this became a huge issue in the state, except nobody knew how it was removed. And in 2018, December of 2018, during the elections, everybody started coming out and saying, hey, we couldn't vote. But this was being told to the election commissioner, the chief electoral officer, and even the UIDAI CEO. All of them came out and saying, look, if there is an issue, it's the other department's issue. UIDAI was saying, oh, if there was indeed an issue, it was the election commission's issue. But all of them, when they push these systems, actually say these systems are 100% accurate. There is no error. And they were 100% accurate, except how do you define accuracy? So in Telangana, what they did is, if you don't have people whose Aadhaar number you do not have, who did not take an Aadhaar, you do not have their Aadhaar, but there are voter IDs. So they said, look, if these people who we do not have their Aadhaar numbers, either they are dead, or they never existed in the first place, or they're duplicates. So they deleted everyone without an Aadhaar number. So it's simply this. So the algorithm was simply this. And after deleting all of these people, then they would compare, and everything is 100%. They have 100% Aadhaar numbers, they have 100% voter IDs, because they've removed everyone else of it. So your accuracy is 97% to 100%, because the way you calculate your percentages itself is flawed. I mean, nobody even knows what the algorithm or the software that they have used. It's not in public domain. Frankly, what I had to do is file RTIs, and after I looked at the entire files, I've arrived at this conclusion that they just simply removed people without Aadhaar cards, but they pushed it as saying, oh, we are getting this algorithm. We're using what is called the software, state resident data hubs and deduplication algorithms. No, there is no deduplication algorithm. Even that deduplication algorithm that they claim was not available until I had to file RTIs to the election commission, and not even the election commission knew what the state of Telangana did. And all of this is actually going further because the state of Telangana now has a new digital ID based on facial recognition, where it wants to use this again on voter deduplication. It has already piloted this like last 2 months ago in January, maybe, where they were using facial recognition to see if there is a duplicate voter, and the accuracy of it was around just 60%. This again came under an RTI which Internet Freedom Foundation filed, but what is a 60% error? I mean, I don't even know how they're calculating that error. So I don't trust these numbers in the first place. So the only thing you can trust is code, and the only way to do that is ask for source codes, and that's really hard. So what I had to do in case of Telangana was actually to go approach the High Court saying that give me the source code. If this is a public system which is doing public function, its source code needs to be public, because I do not know if there is an error in the source which is actually harming me and my voter rights. I'll just end there.
Thank you. And actually on that point, on the kind of development of the source code, I think it's important to kind of look into what source code really means and what it implies. We know that some kinds of biases come into how we develop the code. We know that there are processes of actually collecting the data and using that information as an input and defining the outputs. And Tarunima, you worked in this field of kind of looking into how this is developed and how developers should think about accountability and transparency in the development of an algorithm. Could you elucidate on this a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I'll do this by talking about a problem statement that Tattle is working on at the moment. And so that is that, when we collect a lot of sort of social media content, you need to make a decision of what of that content needs to be archived, right? Because a lot of this content on WhatsApp and ShareChat and a lot of the social media platforms is just like good morning messages and like a lot of romantic memes, which are entertaining. But if we started archiving all of that as well, one, it would like waste a lot of memory, but more importantly, it would drown out some of the more sort of like the more important content, right? So and because we're a very lean team, and there's just like so much content, we have no option but to sort of use a ML process for this. So in English, you come to this question of like what social media content is worth archiving. Now we answer that by saying anything that's potentially misinformation. I mean, there's more, but let's just stick to that explanation. And then you sort of start defining, okay, what is potential misinformation? Do scams count? What about, content that's written with a slight, like with a slant? What about also just generally news content, right? Because when you, like 3 months down the line, that can be spun out of context. And yeah, so that is in the moment also potentially misinformation. So just in this problem formulation phase, there's a lot of sort of negotiation and subjectivity, and there are human decisions in this process. So there's a paper by Samir Pasi and Solan Barokas that just talks about, the sort of contestations in problem formulation. Then there's like the data collection aspect that I'm going to skip in interest of time, also a very important aspect. But then there's like this third aspect where you say that, okay, you want to make this problem formulation, or like whatever I did in step one, that needs to be communicated to a machine, right? And so so obviously the machine doesn't know, for example, what scam posts are. And so the way we do that is by throwing 1,000 examples of something that is a scam post and like 1,000 examples of things that we think are not scam posts. But to throw those 1,000 examples, we have to first go through our content and, say that, okay, this is, like these things count as scam and these things don't. And often there is disagreement at that stage as well. So to give you an example, 3 of us were annotating certain content, and there was a repeating post of a religious figure advocating that people should read certain religious texts, and he had his number at the bottom and urging people to call him. And for 2 people, that was a scam post and should have been archived, and for 1 person, it was just noise and should not have been archived, right? So just at that stage, there's again like a fair bit of subjectivity, and the final stages where you actually like select features based on which the machine should make a decision of whether something's worth archiving or not in our case. And so that, you can say that it can be, for example, if it contains reference to a person, if it contains reference to a place, does it contain an official symbol? But again, all of these are things that we are defining. So in general, I mean, you design this entire pipeline. I think one thing I'm also trying to say with this example is that I don't think there's like running away from, we're already in the system where like in a world where you can't just run away and say that, we're not going to use algorithmic systems and all. And I don't think that's what the panelists are saying either, but just wanted to put it out there. And so I think when you design this pipeline, what's the worst that happens for us is that, like if there's a mistake in this prediction machine, what goes wrong is that something that should have been archived doesn't get archived. But let's transfer, and so it's not the most sort of egregious mistake, but let's transfer this. And I, on purpose, will choose a provocative example, which is the criminal risk assessment system. And then what happens is that the person who is like, there are a bunch of people who design an algorithm, but then the outputs are subject to a third person who had zero control on how things were designed. And the case that everyone here is familiar with is, of course, the ProPublica report on how North Point developed the algorithm, which was that it took a bunch of public data, crunched it in some manner that we did not know how, and then spat out a number. And then some court somewhere use that number to say whether you should make that decision or whether someone should get bail on it or not. And then, as ProPublica pointed out, that system was opaque, but also it was discriminatory. And as important as that, I think that report was like fabulous, but one of the side effects was that somehow we started thinking that that's the only way to like develop a risk assessment algorithm, right? Like in the judicial context. Another example from the US is something that's called the Public Safety Assessment Tool that's being used in the state of Utah. It's developed by a nonprofit called the John P. Arnold Foundation. And in that case, the algorithm uses 9 variables. Any of us, I mean, we can go on the website and see what those 9 variables are. And it's a simple regression equation. So this is something Sahil was mentioning as well, that like a lot of algorithms even now is just like simple statistical methods that have been used for at least like 60 years. And any one of us who's ever, done a y is equal to mx plus c in like grade 10 can make sense of that algorithm. Like you can scrutinize it. It might not, some of the covariates might not be very like intuitive, but you can scrutinize it. But what happens when you build a system that's out in the open is that you lose some accuracy, because you can only pick variables that cannot be gamed, right? Like once you've picked out the algorithm, like, so if someone can use it, so you lose some accuracy, but you gain some transparency. And I think the menu of options within, with like menu of options even for risk assessment is fairly wide, and each option balances, let's say, explainability, accountability, transparency differently from accuracy and efficiency. And I think we all need to be sort of very mindful. So the debates aren't very well served on like either extremes, but we do need to be sort of mindful in what option we're picking out. I think one thing I also sort of think is that this is more from like the work I've done with lending, is that a lot of these accountability mechanisms exist, right? Like we have a right to explanation in what RBI has fair practices code that the RBI has put out for banks. Often your accountability mechanism might just be something, like the boss asking someone, even like within the government, saying that, okay, I want to know why you made a certain decision. So I think there are certain accountability mechanisms that already exist that in like with digital systems need to be enforced a lot better. Yeah, I mean, and so I think like to an extent that all the mechanisms, all the accountability that we think of at the design stage also gets reflected in, what in the final outcome that or the final system that we land up with.
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just a quick note. I know that we're running quite late on time. I hope it's okay if we slightly extend this to incorporate everybody's views. And I'd also just make another request to please stick to 4 or 5 minutes for your interventions. I just wanted to now move on to quickly thinking about the role of journalists in this. You mentioned the ProPublica report, and it's been very critical in using kind of data analytics or kind of journalistic methods in investigating algorithms. So I wanted to move towards Kumar, who's kind of worked on the National Social Registry and other algorithmic or technical projects of the government, to briefly talk about, and this also then to Gopal, to briefly talk about the use of journalistic methods in investigating these technological systems and what challenges you experienced.
Thanks so much, Divij. And yeah, I mean, I agree with some of the speakers who spoke later, that in the beginning itself, you so eloquently explained the context, everybody, that I don't think there would be much for me to add to the subject per se, but I'm glad that you asked more about the journalistic methods that we generally try to implement in investigating these subjects. So I would say 3 things. One, what as a journalist, how I would approach the subject. While the algorithmic accountability, the subject itself could be technical for journalists to delve into, and even for the readers that we cater to may not be interested in what goes behind this topic. But generally, what's important is to communicate it to the masses, that what implications it would have to their lives, and that's where the larger political constituency or against, or even for asking for accountability gets built through the communication that we may be able to do it. And how I would approach is, it is generally that, as Parminder mentioned, that while technology may or may not be neutral, there is always intentions behind how you implement, how you actually install it, and how you design it. So for me, it's always been interesting how the bureaucracy or decision making is done around these algorithms or implementing these algorithms. So generally, what has been the best way to understand or joining the dots of what it could mean for public is to see how the bureaucrats think, or the government machinery think about it. And the best way to do it has been through RTIs or talking to a lot of government sources. Some of us are, I mean, most journalists are survive on a lot of other people's work who do these kind of investigation, filing RTIs, etc. In the case of National Social Registry, Srinivas has had done a lot of RTI work already, and there were good tip-offs to figure out that something of this sort is happening. But again, it took me another 3 months to further keep digging into it and figuring out what it could actually mean, the history of it, and the idea behind this. Because there was already some kind of reporting in media before that which says that, oh, National Social Registry is very important for the service delivery of poor ostensibly, and it sounds like a very good idea, and there would be genuinely a lot of buyer for the idea, including a lot of social activists, because similar in the case of Aadhaar as in the beginning, that technology might help actually providing benefits to poor who are generally left out of these delivery systems. So even in the case of National Social Registry, there were buying in from a good number of social activists who have been working on transparency, etc. And from my own experience, two things came out very interestingly, that even a lot of bureaucrats would not understand the implications of this kind of obsession of the state with algorithms and databases. I, in fact, happened to interview the bureaucrat who actually proposed it, designed it, and was a big proponent of it. And his idea was that within the system, there was a lot of data misrepresentation to show that government was actually doing pretty good on, I mean, the local bureaucracy was fudging data to show the performance of the schemes, and he wanted transparency in it. So he thought that maybe the National Social Registry would be a good idea, where you have data of who is getting the benefits and who is not. But eventually he realized that the misuse of data, so this was a journey for him also to work on it for over 5-6 years, when in the last 5-6 years, we also, there was a public discourse around the misuse of technology as we begin to understand it in specifically in the case of Aadhaar debate. So he also realized that the misuse could be big. And that brings me to my third point, that the state's obsession with big data, how it has, or algorithms in service delivery in the last 10 years or so, or specifically in last 5 years, how it has increased. And now it's actually showing that what could have been the hypothetical fears that most of us observed in case of Aadhaar debate. Also, I personally, as a journalist, would a lot of times see that, oh, these are like hypothetical situations that people are talking about, that, oh, Aadhaar may lead to this, Aadhaar may lead to that, while the government already has a law which has privacy safeguards. This thing, in this case of National Social Registry, actually this becomes a logical conclusion of all that obsession and the fear that was expressed into a worrisome reality, where you have real-time tracking and 360-degree profiling of individuals, which includes their religion, caste, income, demographic data. And then the most important part is that when you have this kind of technology, there is no end to what you can add or add to it and how you can use it for different purposes. So for example, now you have, they want to add it to satellites and then geotag every house. And then they want to even amend the Aadhaar Act to allow that without consent, they can use it for different multiple purposes. So even ostensibly, just 30 seconds more to finish this point. So even ostensibly, if the government could claim that they are doing it for a particular purpose, you never know that even the legal basis that they are putting at one place, tomorrow they could amend it and then use it for different purposes. It could be for NRC, it could be for delimitation exercise during election, it could be even passed to IT cells of the ruling party. So, I mean, these are the possible threats that, and legal safeguards around it could be very difficult to actually implement.
Right. That's, yeah. really interesting in the context of the National Social Registry, definitely. And I think this also comes out in other concerns. So Gopal, kind of, you studied both kind of these social credit scoring mechanisms and facial recognition technologies. So do you have something to add on how you investigated them and what kind of major concerns you flagged from a journalistic perspective?
Sure, thanks. Sorry again about my voice. Also, my cold has been acting up. So if I'm not clear at any point, please just tell me and I'll repeat myself. So yes, as you say, there's we've been talking a lot about the government, especially, but actually this is a broader question which needs to be looked at, not just in terms of government services, but also the private sector, something like lending, or even something like insurance. When we look at the way that these black boxes are affecting people, it raises a lot of concern. And then there's also the question of how this data which powers these decision making is being gathered, and you start to look into that question and you realize, okay, it's not just one company spying on you or anything like that. Everybody is harvesting as much as they can, and then there are brokerages selling this information separately. There is a whole economy of your information out there, and it's all very far from the discussion that we are actually having, because at the end of the day, these government systems are at least at some level open to being questioned, as Srinivas's work has been showing. I mean, he's done such amazing work, but that's only possible in querying the government. But when you start to ask the same questions to the private sector, they can clam up, and they do. So that tends to be actually one of the big challenges, I think, in this space. That, and especially today, as more and more of even the government projects, etc., start to involve the private sector, it becomes harder and harder to get the actual information you need. It's a very time-consuming process in many ways. It boils down for someone like me to just stop and ask questions again and again and again, make friends in the companies and ask them questions again and again and again, look up the ownership patterns, and then see, okay, where is the connecting link here. It's very basic work in that sense, but one of the challenges which we face today is that as newsrooms keep getting gutted, it's harder and harder to justify having people do this work. And so that's why, especially if I look back at my previous job at the Huffington Post, one of the philosophies that I was working under was that we are not going to be the first to the news, which is unfortunately, especially when you look at television news in India, that's such a priority, right? And that's where most people still get their information from. If you talk to my parents, or if you talk to my neighbors, they're going to quote what they heard on television, and over there, this is just not possible. And that is, I think, one of the big problems when we talk about journalism exposing this facet. Just one other sort of thing which I wanted to touch on very quickly was, while we've also been talking about the algorithms, it's worthwhile to look at how they are used as a shield for what are often very on the moment, off the moment decisions by the people on the ground. So, for example, you will find officials saying, okay, I can't do this if you don't have an Aadhaar card, even though there's no rule saying that it's required. Or, for example, there was a case in Bangalore some months ago in February where a person was given a challan for jumping a red light based on a image capture of the number plate. The person demanded to see the picture. They said, no, we can't show you that. That's part of the algorithm. So he has no, I mean, this person doesn't live in that area, has never been to that area. So he's obviously not involved, but we have this black box in front of us. So we're not going to let you even defend yourself. So that's another aspect of this I thought we should probably be looking at.
Thanks, Gopal. That's really fascinating, and thank you for doing all of this good work and investigating this. So for the final part of this session, we're going to move towards thinking about what, and to all the lawyers who have been waiting here, thinking about how the law considers algorithmic systems and the interplay between our constitution, our litigation system, our courts, and algorithmic accountability. And we'll start off with Dr. Krishnaswamy, perhaps to just give a brief overview of, has this question of algorithmic accountability or automated decision making been adequately constitutionalized in India? We've had the Puttaswamy judgment and a bunch of very good judgments leading up from that, thinking about technology. But what kind of guidance does this provide, and what does constitutionalizing this look like?
Yeah. So thanks, Divij. I might not start from Puttaswamy, and and the reason is I don't think that we have legalized it, or we don't have case law, and so we might want to think about this issue more from a first principles point of view and try and figure out where the case law might come and where these issues might arise. So let me just break it up in a way that, and it's been fantastic listening to all the panelists so far, and I've been their interventions have helped frame some of what I'm going to say. So let me just go through this in the way that I'm thinking about it, and hopefully we can talk about it a little more as we go along. So with algorithmic accountability, I guess a primary sort of question is, are we going to develop a new regime, or are we going to work with existing regimes? And my intuition here is that the existing legal rubrics will be adapted. I don't think that, and we've already made this mistake a few times. When we have databases, we think we need a database protection law. And then when we have a UID, we think we need a UID law, which is not somehow different from some database protection law. And then when we have information collection systems at large, we need an information data privacy law. And I don't think that's a useful way to think about this field. I would much rather work with existing rubrics and think about how we adapt them. There have been several interventions talking about why even public accountability or the accountability of public institutions cannot be divorced from the role of private actors. And some part of these interventions seem to be that public institutions outsource to private actors these projects. And to that extent, contract law and company law might be very relevant, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I'll just focus on the public law part of this puzzle, and I think that is difficult enough, and we can be clearer about it than we have been in the past. So if we focus on public law and public institutions, it's useful to think about what is the model that we adopt as the model for decision making generally. So there are three types of ideal type institutions we classify: the legislatures, the courts, and the executive. Most of the discussion today has been about the executive. That's what I'm going to focus on. There's been a passing reference to where automated decision making may play a role with courts, and no reference at all to legislatures. So I think we don't have any expectation that we'll have automated legislation. We might have automated decision making in courts down the line somewhere, but we do have automated decision making in the executive sphere already, and so that's where I think much of the attention is, and we should explore in greater detail. When we think about executive decision making, we have two forms of control that we design into our constitutional system: legal control, which is policed by the courts, and political control, which is policed by public opinion in parliament and legislatures and so on. The political control part of the puzzle is an open question. I guess all of us engage in exerting some degree of accountability to the extent that that the Arogya Setu app code was released through political pressure. It's an example of how political control works. It's not always perfect, but we as lawyers and academics spend a lot more time thinking about legal control and what courts may or may not do. What's important here is that the ideal type decision maker in an administrative system is assumed to be human, and is assumed not to be a human, and I'm just going to paraphrase Daniel Kahneman here, is not thinking fast, but thinking slow. So the priority of the human decision maker in an administrative system is the slow thinker, the deliberative thinker, right? That is our model of accountability. Why do we have that? We have that for two reasons. We think there are some good process reasons to be slow thinkers, and there are some good outcomes reasons to be slow thinkers. And I think some of what I say might be slightly at variance with what others have said, but let me try and illustrate those differences. So on the process side, what kind of processes do we imagine executive decision making to be about? A lot of previous speakers have spoken about transparency, but the real question is that, as Venkatesh put it, the unit of right to information and transparency is the file. So we have the documents on file and we have views and opinions on file. And remember that the RTI system reveals systemic transparency, not just the views of a individual, but the rationality of a system. That is what is meant to be revealed, right, through the system. Now, what do we do when we have automated decision making? We already know from earlier debates on code, and I'm just going to use Benkler and Lessig, that whenever we think about code and law, we think in terms of layers. So there's the physical layer of the device. There is the logical and code layers that we are concerned about. There is the legal layer that sits on top of it. And there's often a plain language layer, or there should be a plain language layer that interfaces with the world. Where do we want transparency? Do we want transparency at the plain language layer? In which case, some of the problems that I think Sahil Dev mentioned, that, if you have a true AI ML package, they may not even know how it's outputting the results. And so, explainability and accountability in a traditional, conventional sense, administrative law sense, full accountability may not be possible at the physical and code layers. It may be possible at the plain language layer or at the legal layer. Is that what we are talking about? Is that what we want? The second element on the process side is we want hearings. Right? We want hearings in public decision making. And what's interesting is most people think that we insist on hearings because it results in, it gives us better results. Not really. Most of the time, courts are interested in hearings because it's dignitarian. It gives dignity to the participants in public decision making. You need not change your decision because you heard somebody. Now, this can actually be digitized and automated. Maybe every automated engine should have a hearing component, and that can be parsed by technology and allocated some kind of score and might influence the result. So it's potentially, it's plausible, though I don't know of any system that already incorporates a meaningful hearing requirement. The last is reasons. We expect public decision makers to give reasons for decision. So I guess the big upshot of automated decision making is that it's fast, and it handles large numbers. Will it also deliver a text-based reasons in large numbers? Potentially it could, because we have enough now pretty effective writing algorithms that can produce plain language explanations for decision. But we might want to ask, what does explainability mean in the context of reasons? And I can see explainability coming in two parts, in the transparency part of the analysis and in the reasons part of the analysis. And we might want to think again, and I use the reference of layers, right? Which layer do you want reasons at? You want reasons at the code layer, or you want reasons at the plain language layer? And more often than not, we wanted reasons at the plain language layer. I'm only going to take 30 seconds more, Divij. On outcome, a lot of people here spoke about efficiency as the primary motor for government relying on automated decision making. What is interesting is that efficiency is not legally mandated. So even if you had inefficient systems, you would not be held legally liable in administrative law or constitutional law for having inefficient systems. What is mandated in some legal sense is an anti-discrimination requirement. And here I'm going to be very quick and jump to the simple point that India does not have strong indirect anti-discrimination requirements. Most automated decision-making will have disparate impact effects, non-intentional effects. You don't mean to treat X kind of person badly, but on average, you treat X kind of person worse than others. And right. India doesn't have a disparate impact analysis. So it's not really clear to me that automated decision-making will suffer. One last thing, optimization is not a big issue. People here spoke about trade-offs between maybe efficiency trade-offs and explanation trade-offs. It may not be such a big thing in India because the law doesn't mandate you to deliver efficiency. So in fact, it mandates you to achieve some other normative goals. which are not related to efficiency. So at least in a legal sense, the optimization frame might be a different one. Stop there.
Thank you. And with that, we'll also move to Alok to kind of, delve more deeply into, what Indian law tells us about accountability, traditionally from an administrative accountability perspective, like how we've treated governmental accountability and how algorithms shift this or affect this.
Yeah. Thanks, Divij. I'll be very quick. Yeah, I'll be very quick because a lot of what I wanted to say, Sudhir has also said, and probably much more better than I could have. But let me just bring a couple of points. I think because we have a very mixed audience, I won't get very much into the legal jargon. See, there are the way administrative law, that area of law which governs how the executive takes its decisions, tries to ensure a level of accountability, is putting in place some requirements before the decision is taken and some procedures after the decision is taken. And I think both of these have some role to play with each other. It isn't as if we can solve all our problems by making sure that things are done before the decision is taken, or that as long as we provide for something after the decision is taken, things will be taken care of. There has to be an interplay of both. So what do I mean by this? For example, and some parts of our administrative law are codified. It's not entirely judge-made. If you take the Income Tax Act, if you take many kinds of tax legislation, how a decision should be taken is actually put down in words and letters. It says, give hearing, send show cause notice, give this much time, give that much time. So all of that is provided for. And in some places, I suppose, our law also provides for efficiency. If I have to disagree a little bit with Sudhir, but it says that we could take a decision within this period of time. But maybe it's not it's more perhaps for fairness rather than efficiency, but it also mandates a certain level of efficiency. Now, when the law provides for these things, it gives an opportunity for the person affected by it. Now, when we say explainability, I just saw a question which quickly popped up there. And I think the larger concern of law, it may be, it may be a question of policy when we want transparency at the level of court. But to draw upon what Sudhir said, I think the larger concern of law and of discussions like this is to ensure that the person affected by it, like in administrative law, we have a test. When do all these requirements apply? When somebody's civil rights are affected. When someone's rights granted by law, under any law, and some law is affected, that is when a lot of these requirements come in. Nobody expects a fair hearing if you just need to sort of redesignate some officers who might take a decision. That is an internal administrative measure. But suppose if it matters whether an officer at this level or this level takes a decision, it is only then that you're minded to give a hearing and so on and so forth. This impact on someone's rights is something that should inform our discussion about how explainable some of the code should be, or not code, or how an algorithm works. Finally, one last point, and most of what I wanted to say, Sudhir has covered. When we're talking about how we can adapt, and I agree with Sudhir, we have to look to adapt existing legal mechanisms, existing legal frameworks, build upon existing precedents, and so on, if we need to address new technology. One last point that I sort of want to make about this use of algorithmic decision making is that I do not think any government in the world will give up its power to make decisions. Like, it will never allow machines to completely replace the persons in the system. At best, I suppose it may reduce a certain level of discretion. And that is where there is scope for challenging the way in which these decisions are taken. I don't think any government wants to entirely remove the element of discretion altogether. Of course, they want to minimize it. Of course, they would want to have less arbitrariness, since Siddharth just asked that question. But I do think that at best, this kind of algorithmic inputs will be used for decision making. So, in as much as we should be able to not just focus entirely on the algorithm or the code or the machine learning part of it, but also who is empowered to use it, how do they use it, how do they take decisions on that basis. I'll just stop there and let the others.
Thanks, Alok. And yeah, finally, then kind of moving from those legal principles into actually operationalizing them, right? And to see how the courts actually view these. And we have people who have litigated these systems before the Supreme Court, before various forums. So I wanted to go to you, Vrinda, just to explain kind of, the challenges that you faced in bringing these questions forward to a court, right? Particularly complex technological systems, which people don't clearly understand, which the judges may not clearly understand. What's your experience been, and how do you, how have you framed strategies around litigating technologies?
Yeah, thanks. Just tell me if I'm sort of going too over my time, and I'll stop there. So some of, I think what we've seen in the last couple of years in terms of litigating tech systems in courts is the increased use of expert affidavits, RTIs, and parliamentary questions. So these three, I feel, are sort of ways in which you're able to convey some sort of explanation of how the tech is working. So in Aadhaar, for surveillance, there were expert affidavits that were filed. Unfortunately, in Aadhaar, the court didn't really give much attention to the petitioner's affidavits. And when the government was trying to explain the system, Ajay Bhushan Pandey, who was the CEO of UIDAI at that point, came and gave a presentation. So even when you talk about litigating technology in court, you have to understand that the government and the petitioners are often have different, symmetries of information, different paths. So when the UIDAI can come and explain through a presentation how the system works, and they also give this physical demonstration with how do you actually do an enrollment. The petitioners were not allowed to cross-examine him. So just, I think we have to be cognizant that sometimes there are these, differences in the leeway that is given to petitioners and to the state. One place where I thought we were able to use expert affidavits effectively, although the court may not have given it as much importance, was both in Arogya Setu and in the Jammu and Kashmir High Court litigation. So if in Jammu and Kashmir, we were talking about restoring 4G access. So the question, this is the second post Anuradha Bhasin judgment. The Supreme Court, after the Supreme Court's order, the government had restored 2G access to the entire union territory. Our contention was during COVID times especially, it is absolutely essential to have 4G, and the government's orders should be struck down as being disproportionate. So a lot of the case comes down to what is the actual impact of 4G versus 2G. And so we actually had an expert affidavit where Prateek, who is our expert, explained the difference of 2G and 4G in terms of running simulated tests. So he had these observed 2G speeds and observed 4G speeds, and there was a lot of technical analysis. But the layman conclusion that he gave was, for instance, how long does it take to stream a video on YouTube if you're on 2G or if you're on 4G, right? So that may become important for online education classes. How long could you access the WHO COVID dashboard? So one of the things he found was on a 2G speed, you couldn't access the COVID dashboard. How long does it take to download an app like the Arogya Setu app on 2G versus 4G? Another interesting finding was that a 20-minute video on YouTube can take up to 1 hour, 30 minutes on a 2G speed, right? So when you're talking about any real learning, that's not going to happen. And this is without having actual problems like network congestion, timeouts, which are more practical concerns, which you can't really simulate. So I think that was a really helpful way of explaining this very technical aspect of what does 2G mean. I mean, we all know theoretically that 2G doesn't work, but what does that mean in practice? In the Arogya Setu litigation, so, I saw someone ask a question about false positives and false negatives. So, there is all this writing on contact tracing apps having issues with false positive and false negatives. So apart from just putting academic literature, it is more helpful in my view to have an expert affidavit. So we had Professor Subhashish Banerjee, who was from IIT, who explained in sort of very simple terms that there are, what are the efficiency and what are the privacy issues with contact tracing. So, even if we want to explain that to a judge, you sort of just take them through that, because experts can then tailor the affidavit to the particular context, which an academic article might not do. And I think all of this is very important, because today any tech litigation is going to eventually have to answer the question of proportionality, which is essentially at some level a factual question. Is there a less restrictive alternative that is available? So to be able to make that argument, there has to be some sort of facts before the court where you're trying to explain these are the various alternatives. This is the alternatives the government could have used. And so hence they fail the, the test of proportionality. The other prong of proportionality is the impact, is to show the disparate impact. So another way we were using this in Arogya Setu and in Aadhaar was to actually have, in Aadhaar, Nikhil, they gave an affidavit saying, this is how exclusion was happening on the ground. In the Kashmir matter, we had a journalist who spoke to people in Kashmir who said, this is how, lack of 4G internet is impacting people. And some of the things it sort of brought out are very intuitive, but not something you would have thought about. So one of the things that came out, for instance, was this geography teacher saying, look, without the internet and without actual face-to-face classes, we can't do classes on WhatsApp. How do I explain to them what a globe looks like? How do I explain, how would you, like, it's like an onion. You have to peel out these different layers. And on, WhatsApp, or on this one-dimensional like DD. So the government was arguing that, we have this, the DD channel, and there can be sort of education in a one-way manner. He says, how do we respond to answers in those contexts. So I actually need proper internet to be able to just explain different three-dimensional concepts, for instance. So I think these are just some of the challenges of trying to explain the technology to the judges. And just one last example I'd like to give. So obviously we have to assume that judges may not be conversant with the technology, and many times even lawyers are not, right? So for instance, if I were to litigate an AI algorithm in court, I would require someone explain to me in as simple a manner so that I can explain to the judges what is the meaning of black box? What is the meaning of explainability? So in the WhatsApp Facebook privacy case, one of the things that we were initially trying to explain to the judges was how targeted advertising works. So, what is the implication of what Facebook having so much data? So we actually did this test, Facebook, we paid for this like test Facebook ad to show how targeted advertising would work. To say that, if you given these sort of 4 parameters, this is the information that Facebook gives you. And this is why data is very important. So I'm going to keep it short, but if there are any further questions, I'm sort of happy to answer that.
Thanks, Vrinda. And we'll move finally to Rahul. Similar question. You were heavily involved in the Aadhaar litigation, as you mentioned. What are these kind of challenges that you see, getting access to relevant evidence about the technology? How do courts understand, private petitioners' understanding of the technology versus challenging or versus, say, the government's exit on this? Yeah.
Thanks, Divij. I think Vrinda has already answered a great deal of what you meant about the evidence, and I think she answered completely so well that I don't really need to add very much more to that. I think that, to a large extent for Vrinda and for me, and for I think so many of the other people on this call, Aadhaar was kind of a crucible battle. We became hopefully slightly better public lawyers and certainly more capable of strategizing technology litigation than before. I think one of the important, the way I've thought about this is divided into 2 parts. One is the pre-litigation process and one is how the litigation actually happens. Now, in terms of how the litigation actually happens, I think Vrinda has already dealt with the evidence. The only thing I would like to add is in terms of pleadings that, firstly, again, as Vrinda said, pretty much only fools rush in. You have to understand the technology first before you challenge it. You should know exactly what you're talking about. And even more importantly, this is a general litigation rule in any case. The fact is that you have to show, you don't have to tell, which means that you wait for the right time and fight a challenge. In fact, for us, the challenges in Aadhaar began in 2012, but they only picked up traction and public support in 2015-16 when people actually saw what was going on. So in terms of that, I really wonder if had we been able to file at a particular point of time, would that have made a difference to the final outcome of the battle as it happened? Secondly, in terms of how judges react to things, it is very important to see that judges are not experts. They don't spend any great amount of time looking at particular challenges. So the way we do this is we have to apply the facts to the legal principles. Again, this is, I don't know, for lawyers, it's fairly common sense. But the fact of the matter is, for a judge, you have to explain to him in language which he or she can understand, which basically means we apply the facts to the principles. The clear stated old ancient principles, we apply the facts to them and we see how it works. And again, one very important thing which we learned again the hard way, I think sometimes, is that understatement helps more than overstatement. When you promise promise a great deal and you're not able to deliver, the judges immediately shut their minds. So I think it's also sort of important, the language which you use in your pleadings is extremely important. And now I guess back to the main part of it, the first part of it, the thinking through the challenge. Obviously, every change is not a bad thing. Status quo is not written in stone. It's not the best thing which should be there. And we have to challenge it based on what actually happens. For example, the type of system it is. If it's a system which is very closely linked to welfare, then of course we have to examine the challenge much more carefully. If it's a general system, like for example, waiting 2 minutes for buses, then I wouldn't really spend too much time focusing on that. Again, for judges and for Indians as a whole, there is this inherent bias in favor of technological solutions. Everybody thinks that that's the actual answer because the computer says so. Remember that old British show called Little Britain, where they said computer says no? That's the answer. That's where it ends for 95% of people, including the government. If it answers no, then you are a fake. And you argue out of that is another big problem. So this is something which has to be considered at the start. And again, people tend to judge technology on its objectives rather than on its impact. Oh, this is going to be so wonderful, which is basically what to a large extent what the government case in Aadhaar was, and that worked remarkably well. Then again, petitioners, again, and this is again something which the SG has raised, which again seems to be a problem, that the credibility of the petitioners matters a great deal. So that is something to be considered as well. And for finally, one final thing about challenge, with which I'm going to conclude, is the fact that sometimes you don't challenge the whole program because it's like the program is like a curate's egg. It's good in parts, it's bad in parts. So maybe a strategic litigation would focus on what is bad and what is achievable, rather than a big theoretical challenge where you throw everything at it, attack from the front, and then get completely decimated. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Rahul. That was really important. And I'm glad that this conversation is being recorded for posterity. Thank you, everyone, for attending, all of the attendees, all of the panelists. It's been a really fascinating, I know we extended quite a bit, but I really couldn't bring myself to stop anybody. And we're running a little bit over time, but thank you for everyone who logged in. This conversation is up on YouTube on the Media Nama channel. Thanks for asking all of your questions, and I hope they're addressed in the course of how this conversation evolves. Please be in touch with me. I think the invite should have a lot of my details in case you're interested in my work on this subject or Mozilla's work. And yeah, for all the if we can stop the webinar and the recording now, and I just want to address the panelists. Arun, is that fine?
Yep, I can get the.
Yeah. Right. To all the panelists who are also attending the workshop, which I think is all of you, I'm really sorry that we ran so much over time. We'll cut short on the workshop to accommodate the time we have. If you could just take